The crowd stood silent, watching as he prepared to face a death more painful than anything imaginable. His ribs would soon be severed, and his lungs pulled out like wings. Here are the 7 most inhumane punishments ever used in history. Viewer discretion is advised. In the 5th century BCE, the Persian Empire became infamous for a horrifying method of execution known as scaphism, or the boats. This gruesome punishment was reserved for the worst criminals, especially traitors. The ordeal began when the victim was bound between 2 hollowed-out logs, leaving only their head, arms, and legs exposed. They were then force-fed a sickening mixture of milk and honey, an act that would soon turn the punishment into a living nightmare. While the force-feeding caused intense diarrhea, the true horror lay in how the milk and honey coated the victim's skin, attracting swarms of insects. Flies, wasps, and vermin would descend upon the helpless victim, feasting on their flesh and crawling into every open wound or orifice. Trapped in their own filth, the victim would suffer as their body began to rot from the inside out, all while still alive. One of the most infamous cases of scaphism involved a Persian soldier named Mithridates. During a chaotic battle, Mithridates accidentally struck a fatal blow to Cyrus the Younger, the brother of King Artaxerxes II. The king's fury knew no bounds, as this unintended death disrupted the royal family and the empire itself. In his rage, Artaxerxes sentenced Mithridates to scaphism. For 17 agonizing days, he endured this living hell, slowly being consumed by infection and the relentless insects until his body finally gave out. Though scaphism was seldom used, its reputation ensured that it was remembered for centuries as one of the most inhumane punishments ever devised. This method of torture faded from use with the decline of the Persian Empire. But the ocean carried its own horrors for those who defied authority. Sailing the high seas was dangerous enough, but for those who broke the rules aboard pirate ships and navy vessels, the punishment was often worse than the perils of the ocean itself. One of the most feared punishments during the 17th and 18th centuries was keel hauling. Used primarily by the Dutch and pirates, this brutal method involved tying the condemned sailor to a rope that ran beneath the ship's keel. The victim would be dropped over the side of the ship and dragged underneath the hull, where sharp barnacles clung to the bottom. These razor-sharp creatures tore into the sailor's flesh, leaving deep gashes and wounds that rarely healed. As the sailor was pulled from one side of the ship to the other, they would also risk drowning, submerged long enough to inhale water, but not long enough to die. For those who survived, the physical trauma was horrific, but the emotional toll was even worse. Infection from the saltwater and open wounds often followed, making survival a prolonged and agonizing process. One notorious case in the Dutch Navy involved a ship's surgeon who, after being found guilty of negligence, was keel-hauled in front of the entire crew as a grim reminder of the consequences of failure. Though keel hauling was eventually banned by most navies, its impact on maritime discipline was long-lasting. But while sailors feared the depths of the sea, those on land dreaded the crushing weight of their punishment. One of the most terrifying punishments in history was the breaking wheel, also known as the Catherine wheel. Used widely across Europe from the medieval period through the 19th century, the breaking wheel was designed to prolong death through maximum suffering, ensuring that every bone in the body was shattered before the final breath was drawn. The condemned would be tied to a large wooden wheel with their limbs stretched out along its spokes. An executioner would then proceed to systematically break their arms, legs, and joints with a heavy hammer or cudgel. Sometimes this was done in a specific order, starting from the ankles and working upward to ensure the greatest amount of pain. In other cases, the executioner would randomly strike, adding an element of unpredictability to the horror. Victims often lingered for hours or even days, their bodies contorted in unnatural ways, bones protruding through the skin, while onlookers watched the spectacle. For some, a final merciful blow to the head or chest, known as the coup de grace, would end the suffering. But for others, death came slowly through shock, dehydration, or exposure to the elements. The breaking wheel was used for the most heinous crimes, such as treason and murder. One of the most infamous cases involved a German serial killer named Peter Niers, who was accused of over 500 murders in the 16th century. Niers received 42 blows over 2 days before he finally died, each stroke of the wheel intended to prolong his agony. Though the breaking wheel vanished in the 19th century, the weight of its cruelty lingers. But those who remain silent may also have to fear a different, crushing penalty. In the 16th century, England had a punishment that sent chills through anyone who dared defy the crown's justice: pressing. Though not technically considered torture by the law, the slow, crushing force of this punishment was one of the most brutal ways to die. Its purpose was clear: either submit or be crushed. Literally. Pressing was designed to force a suspect to enter a plea in court. Without a plea, there could be no trial. For the authorities, this wasn't about mercy. It was about making sure the accused could be properly convicted. If they refused, pressing would do the talking for them. The method was simple, but horrifying. The condemned was laid flat on the ground with a wooden door placed on top of their body. Heavy stones or weights were added, little by little, crushing them under the unbearable load until their body could take no more. One of the most notable victims of this method was Margaret Clitheroe, a Catholic woman living in Protestant England. Margaret was deeply committed to her faith at a time when harboring Catholic priests was a crime, punishable by death. In 1586, her quiet defiance caught up with her. Authorities found a secret room in her home, used to shelter priests, and she was arrested. Margaret had been jailed before for refusing to attend Anglican services, but this time things escalated. Knowing she was guilty, Margaret refused to enter a plea, a calculated decision to protect her family. If she didn't plead, the trial couldn't proceed, and her property would stay with her family, something the Crown couldn't seize. But this act of silence came at a price. With no plea, Margaret was sentenced to pressing. Stripped in public, she endured the degrading ritual meant to shame and weaken her spirit. Then she was laid down on the cold, hard ground, a wooden door pressed against her chest. Slowly, stone after stone was piled on top. The pressure building as her ribs cracked and her spine began to break under the crushing force. The agony was unbearable, yet she never uttered a word. It was a slow death, and when the weight became too much, Margaret's body gave out. Pressing as a form of punishment was later outlawed in 1772, but left a lasting impression. Much like the downfall of one of Japan's most infamous outlaws, who tried to keep his son alive. Ishikawa Goemon was a 16th century outlaw, a kind of Robin Hood figure, stealing from the rich and giving to the poor. His legendary exploits made him a hero to some, but an enemy to those in power. Goemon's story came to a tragic and fiery end when he was caught trying to assassinate the powerful warlord Toyotomi Hideyoshi. He planned to sneak into Hideyoshi's castle and kill him in revenge for the death of his wife and the capture of his son. But things didn't go as planned. A small noise alerted the guards, and Goemon was captured before he could complete his mission. Hideyoshi was not a man to show mercy. For his crime, Goemon was sentenced to one of the most brutal forms of execution imaginable. He was boiled alive in a massive iron cauldron. And if that wasn't horrific enough, Goemon's young son was sentenced to die alongside him. On the day of his execution, Goemon and his son were led to the cauldron. The boiling water bubbled and steamed as the crowd gathered to watch. Goemon, in his final moments, tried to hold his son above the boiling water, hoping to save him from the agonizing heat. According to some versions of the story, Goemon managed to keep his son alive until the last moment, when he finally succumbed to the heat and pain. Goemon's death became the stuff of legend in Japan. His defiance in the face of such a gruesome execution cemented his place in history. And today, he's remembered not just as a thief, but as a symbol of resistance against tyranny. But before this, there used to be even more terrifying punishments, even for much smaller crimes. Let's head over to ancient Persia, where the punishment for stealing was far worse than you might imagine. If you were caught stealing, your fate wasn't a slap on the wrist or even imprisonment. Instead, you were met with one of the most grotesque and horrifying deaths known to man: being torn apart by trees. Here's how it worked. First, the authorities would find two trees growing close together. Then the tops of the trees were bent and tied together with rope. The thief's legs were then fastened to each tree, one leg to each tree. Once everything was in place, the executioners would cut the ropes holding the trees down. And that's when things got gruesome. With nothing holding them back, the trees would snap upright, yanking the thief's body in two. The sheer force of the trees pulling in opposite directions would tear the person apart, leaving one half of the body dangling from each tree. It was a horrifying spectacle, designed to be a clear message: steal, and this could be you. The Persians didn't stop there. To further drive the point home, they often executed thieves at the site of the crime. This way, anyone who came across the scene would see the gruesome aftermath, the two halves of the body hanging from the trees, and be reminded of the consequences of theft. The Persians made sure that the sight of a body torn in half was burned into the minds of anyone who dared to steal. But the Vikings found a way to make betrayal even more agonizing by turning the human body itself into a spectacle of agony. This might be the most gruesome punishment I've ever heard of. The blood eagle was one of the most horrifying and extreme forms of execution in Viking history. It wasn't just about death. It was a ritual designed to cause prolonged, excruciating pain while making a spectacle of the victim's suffering. The blood eagle was a punishment used on those who had committed acts of grave betrayal or had deeply angered Viking rulers. It was a method of execution where the victim's back was sliced open from the neck down. The ribs were carefully severed from the spine one by one using sharp blades. Once the ribs were detached, they were pulled outward, leaving the internal organs, particularly the lungs, exposed. The lungs were then pulled through the open wounds and spread over the victim's shoulders to resemble wings. This grotesque display earned the name Blood Eagle because the ribs and lungs, dripping with blood, resembled an eagle's wings. The victim, still alive at this stage, would endure unimaginable agony as they suffocated or bled. The entire process could last for hours, prolonging the suffering and ensuring the audience understood the full extent of the punishment. The Vikings would often perform the blood eagle in front of a crowd, as it was meant to be a public display of vengeance and power. One account of the blood eagle involved Jarl Borg, a chieftain who betrayed the legendary Viking Ragnar Lothbrok. After being captured for attacking Ragnar's homeland, Borg was sentenced to death by blood eagle. In front of a gathering of warriors, his back was laid bare. His ribs were severed from his spine, and his lungs were pulled out and displayed like wings. The ritual was performed to exact revenge and send a clear message to anyone who dared to betray the Viking code of loyalty. By the end of the Viking Age, around the 11th century, the ritual likely faded into obscurity as Norse societies became more Christianized, adopting less barbaric forms of justice in line with European legal practices. The last known references to the blood eagle in historical texts occur in skaldic poetry and sagas from the 12th and 13th centuries. While today we might shudder at the thought of such a brutal death, for centuries they were a part of life, used to maintain order, exact revenge, or uphold the values of a particular culture. Which do you think was the worst? If you found these stories fascinating, please subscribe. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.